Welcome to Free Thought Matters. I'm Annie Laurie Gaylor.
And I'm Dan Barker. We are co-presidents of the Freedom from Religion Foundation, which is currently a 33,000-member nonprofit association of freethinkers. Freethinkers are atheists and agnostics, and we work to keep state and church separate and also to educate the public about non-theism.
You can join the Freedom from Religion Foundation or ask for information and a sample of our newspaper, Free Thought Today, at ffrf.org.
Now we're really pleased. Our guest today is the philosopher Ben Nadler. He got his PhD from the Department of Philosophy at Columbia University, and he is currently a professor of philosophy, humanities, and Jewish studies at the University of Wisconsin, right here in Madison, Wisconsin.
That's right. And Steve Nadler's 13 books include Spinoza, A Life, The Best of All Possible Worlds, A Story of Philosophers, God and Evil, a book forged in hell, Spinoza's scandalous Treatise, and the Birth of the Secular Age. And in 2017, his book Heretics, The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy, was published as a graphic book illustrated by Ben Nadler.
Ben Nadler.
Ben Nadler, I'm sorry.
Ben Nadler. Ben Nadler is your son,
yes.
Right? Boy, what a father-son team.
It was a great deal of fun.
Oh, yeah. Well, how much work was it to do all those illustrations?
For him, it was a tremendous amount of work. I think there were over 900 drawings he had to do. He all did them all by hand. So my work was done pretty easy once we got the text finished. That took a couple of months, and then it took him over a year to get all the drawings done.
Now we want to talk about Heretics, but first a little bit about your interest and the books you've written in Spinoza. And for someone who's not familiar with Spinoza, can you give us a little recap?
Sure. Spinoza was probably the most radical philosopher, certainly in the 17th century, and perhaps the most radical philosopher before modern times. He was born in Amsterdam to a Portuguese Jewish family, but by the age of 23, he had been excommunicated or banned from the Portuguese Jewish community of Amsterdam.
And that was a big deal, wasn't it?
It was a very big deal, and we don't really know exactly what he had done. The banning document simply speaks of his abominable heresies and monstrous deeds.
He was thinking for himself, maybe. That was the abominable.
He certainly was, and when you read his mature philosophical treatises, you get a very good sense of what he must have been saying just a few years earlier. He essentially denies the existence of a providential God. God is nature, and everything that happens as a result of nature's laws and processes. There are no miracles, there's no creation. The Bible is just a work of human literature. Virtue just consists in the rational pursuit of self-interest, whereby one comes to the aid of others only because one wants to create a society in which people are mutually beneficial.
So he was a humanitarian,
Very
really,
much so,
or a
yes.
humanist.
Yes.
So you wrote a book about his book. It's called A Book Forged in Hell. So why do you say it was a book? What was the book and why was it forged in hell?
Well, I don't call it forged in hell. It was his critics. Spinoza's book was published in 1670, and it caused an outrage among theologians, among academics, and even among political and civic authorities. And one critic called it a book forged in hell by the devil himself. And the problem was that Spinoza's project in this book is to undermine the attempts by theologians and religious and ecclesiastic authorities to start controlling the reins of political power, to controlling people's lives. And he was afraid that the Dutch Republic, where he lived, was falling into this trap of becoming a bit of a theocracy, where the Calvinist preachers and the leaders of the Dutch Reformed Church were accumulating too much power. So the purpose of this book was to undermine their authority by showing that the Bible is just a work of human literature. It's not literally written by God. That miracles are impossible because everything happens in nature through deterministic necessity, and especially that freedom of thought and freedom of expression are absolutely essential to a healthy, functioning society.
Wow. And he was I'm sorry.
Well, and then you have also written an entire biography of Spinoza. So,
right.
Spinoza, A Life is the title of that book.
Right, and that attempts to put this extremely radical thinker in the context of what was a fascinating and turbulent period in European history. The Dutch Republic was a relatively new nation, and they really were the first to welcome, with very few restrictions, to welcome Jews to settle, especially in Amsterdam. And it was a smart economic and political move because this Jewish community, mostly Portuguese and Spanish Jews fleeing the Inquisition, contributed a great deal to the Dutch Republic's economy, to their social and financial life.
And they're still known for their open-mindedness, aren't they? It's
Yes.
a progressive society, and they've always been big on freedom of religion.
Yes. In fact, in this founding document of the Dutch Republic, which was the Union of Utrecht in 1579, explicitly states that no one is to be bothered with respect to their religious belief. Now, they didn't really abide by that very strictly. Catholics, for example, were not allowed for a long time to practice their religion openly, primarily because the Dutch had just liberated themselves from Catholic Spain,
Yeah.
and they were a Calvinist country.
And the Dutch came over and created New Amsterdam on Manhattan, which carried some of that same tolerance. And even today, New Amsterdam is now New York City, and you still have that same kind of inheritance of openness and egalitarianism and freedom and
diversity.
As
Yeah.
opposed to up north where the Calvinists were up in Massachusetts.
Well, before we go to heretics, tell us a little bit more about Spinoza. How did it all turn out?
Well, it turned out well in the long run, because I do think Spinoza bears a good deal of credit for opening up discussions of democracy, secularity, and toleration, because the Theological Political Treatise, his inflammatory book, really was a vigorous defense of democracy, of freedom of speech, for a reduction of the power of ecclesiastics to control people's lives. And even though it caused a tremendous uproar in the years immediately after its publication, over time I think it's correct to think of Spinoza as somebody who was one of the early founders of the modern European Enlightenment.
Then your book, Heretics, which is really what we want to concentrate on today, the one you worked with your son, Ben, who drew all the illustrations. That book puts Spinoza in the context of the 17th century Enlightenment and all of that. And so he didn't exist in a vacuum. There were precursors. You start with Bruno. Do we have a picture of Stephen and Ben on the? There we go. There's the two of you working together. Look like father and son there.
Yep.
And so you put Spinoza in context of what was going on through that whole 17th century. And
yeah, philosophy was very much a dialogue. It's not that these were solitary figures holed away in their studies. They knew each other in many cases personally. Leibniz, Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, a German philosopher, visited Spinoza in The Hague through correspondence, through personal meetings, and through reading each other's works. There was a real dialogue, a conversation going on. It wasn't an isolated affair. And in Heretics, we try to put all these philosophical ideas not just in the context of the lives of the philosophers, but the social and political and religious context of philosophy in the period.
So let's start with the first heretic that we.
Well, let's look at the trailer.
Oh, okay.
The publisher made a great trailer, like a movie trailer for your book, because it's such an illustrated book. And you call it Dangerous Ideas. I think that's the subtitle of it.
The Wondrous and Dangerous Beginnings of Modern Philosophy.
Yeah, so let's look at the trailer, which really introduces us to this wonderful book. That's really great. It's like you're in a movie theater watching a...
Right. In a world where heretics flourish.
Yeah, wow. Well, and they were heretics, and they suffered for it. I think the first we have some images from the book we can look at. I think Bruno was your first one. Is that right?
He was. I wanted to start out with a bang, and the very first lines of the book are, "The 17th century did not start out well for philosophy."
Wow.
Although I should say that the word heretic is ambiguous. Only a couple of the individuals here were officially declared heretic by any body. Bruno and Spinoza, for example. Galileo was accused of suspicions of heresy, which is different from being labeled a heretic. But all of the thinkers, or most of them, found their works banned by the Roman Catholic Church on the Index of Prohibited Books. So there's a sense in which the Church regarded, if not the individuals as heretics, the ideas as dogmatically unacceptable.
And quickly, Bruno was a monk or priest who got into trouble.
Right, for both his theological views and even for his scientific speculations.
And he was burned at the stake then for that.
Yes, right in Rome.
Wow.
And who else do we have, a heretic, coming up?
Well, here's another picture from the book. Is this Galileo?
This is Galileo, who around 1610 introduced a new body of evidence for the Copernican hypothesis. Between the moons of Jupiter, the phases of Venus, Galileo, in his writings, without insisting that the Copernican system was absolutely true, went a long way towards undermining the Ptolemaic conception of the universe, where the Earth is the center of things.
So back then, were philosophy and physics pretty much the same thing?
Yeah, there really was in the 17th century no distinction between philosophy and science. What we think of as science was natural philosophy, that is philosophizing about nature. So even Isaac Newton called his book Principles of Natural Philosophy.
Well, 350 years after he was put under house arrest, I believe the Pope finally forgave Galileo. Do you remember that?
It took some thinking, but I guess it finally came around. Interestingly enough, the Amsterdam Jewish community recently considered whether the ban on Spinoza should be lifted, and they came to the conclusion that it should not.
Oh, no.
Really?
Not because they still think that there's something dangerous about his ideas, but because they felt it would be disrespectful to the rabbis who had a lot more information and who were right in the middle of things at the time. But as well, the ideas that Spinoza was promoting, according to the present rabbi of the Amsterdam congregation, believe that these are still not acceptable ideas.
They're still heretical.
They are still heretical. And in a sense, he's right. Not that we should be in favor of banning people for their ideas, but from a strictly rabbinical perspective, at least according to this rabbi, these are not acceptable ideas, so it's totally within his rights to keep the ban in place.
And maybe Spinoza would have embraced the title heretic.
I think so. I think Spinoza's reaction would be, do what you want. He probably wouldn't have cared about whether the ban was lifted or not. First of all, he's dead, and in the Jewish tradition, a cherem, or a ban, is an action taken upon a living person. And it's a kind of social, economic, religious, and even political ostracism. So when you're dead, it doesn't matter.
So we have a minute before we have to take a break here. Who else can we see here before up on the screen? Oh, Descartes now. There's
Descartes, yes.
Was Descartes a heretic?
Well, his books were placed on the Index of Prohibited Books by the Church.
Ah.
I think there's another Descartes image up here. It was a time when ideas could be dangerous.
So here, Descartes was actually looking for a copy of Galileo's books in 1633, and he couldn't find them, and he had heard that they had been burned, falsely, I think, that they had been burned in Rome, and they weren't available. And he said, well, maybe I shouldn't publish my ideas right now.
Suppression.
So we're going to take a break here. We're talking with philosopher and author Stephen Nadler, especially about his new book, the graphic book, Heretics, which was illustrated by his son, Ben Nadler. So stay tuned. After the break, we'll come back with more of Stephen Nadler and Heretics.
Hi, I'm Ron Reagan, an unabashed atheist, and I'm alarmed by the intrusions of religion into our secular government. That's why I'm asking you to support the Freedom from Religion Foundation, the nation's largest and most effective association of atheists and agnostics, working to keep state and church separate, just like our founding fathers intended. Please support the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Ron Reagan, lifelong atheist, not afraid of burning in hell.
Welcome back to Free Thought Matters, and we're speaking with Professor Stephen Nadler about heretics. And I think who's next?
Well, you were saying that it could have been well, it can still be dangerous sometimes to be speaking heresy, but it was so dangerous back then. We saw Bruno was burned at the stake, but people were actually thrown out of windows.
Well, they weren't thrown out the windows for their philosophical ideas. Those were ambassadors. That was a political situation. Those were ambassadors from the Holy Roman Emperor in Bavaria trying to prevent a breakaway from the Palatinate, which was one of the domains within the Holy Roman Empire. And his ambassadors were thrown out of the window, the defenestration of Prague. And this basically began the 30 Years' War.
Oh, really?
So it does show that it was a dangerous time to have different philosophical or political views, right?
Right, because the Bavarian emperor, of course, was a Catholic, and the ruler of Bohemia was a Protestant. And the 30 Years' War was essentially, aside from all its political dimensions, very much a religious war, or a series of religious wars.
And here's a very good argument to keep state and church separate.
Yes.
And it wasn't just men who were doing the thinking. There were some women in your book as well. A woman named Elizabeth. Tell us about Elizabeth.
So Elizabeth was actually the princess of Bohemia. She was the daughter of the ruler of Bohemia. And when they were forced to flee during the course of the war, they ended up in the Netherlands. And she entered into a correspondence with Descartes over having read his works. And it's a philosophically very rich correspondence. And she was just one of these brilliant minds. Being a woman, she couldn't have attended university, but she was self-educated and tutored by others, and played a very important role in the philosophical dialogue that was going on.
And the mind-body question back then.
Yes.
That we're still struggling with.
And she also consulted Descartes on some issues of the passions and morality, sadness. And her situation was a very sad one, in fact. Living in exile, the family was never able to return to Bohemia. And she ended up actually at the end of her life in England. And so Descartes, part of the correspondence with Descartes involved dealing with these sorts of turmoils in your life.
So she was exiled because she was a heretic? Or?
No, her father was exiled because he lost, he was kicked out of Bohemia by the Holy Roman Emperor as a part of the political battle.
And now we come to the centerpiece of the book, which, for good reason, is Spinoza, because you're a Spinoza expert. There's a lot of pages of Spinoza, his ideas, his life, what was going on at the time. I think there's 8 or 9. Let's just go through these, and maybe you might make a comment about some of these.
Sure. This is the first page on the Spinoza chapter, and this is the arrival of the Sephardic Jews in Holland, fleeing the Inquisition and looking for a more tolerant place where they could actually practice Judaism openly.
Wow. And then?
And this is the excommunication, or the cherem, of Spinoza by the leaders of that congregation. And it is a bit of a mystery why he was excommunicated, and scholars argue about whether it was just a matter of financial irregularities, or was it a matter of truly heretical ideas. I think it was clearly a matter of heretical ideas. The banning document is just a long litany of curses, and Spinoza's ban is a permanent one, whereas most of the other bans from the community are small-scale punishments for this or that violation of the regulations.
And here's some more images of Spinoza's life.
So he was a lens grinder, and that's how he earned his living.
So he had a day job, and then he wrote philosophy at night?
Yeah. Philosophy didn't pay that well back then, unless you were a university professor.
Well, a lens is a good analogy for the Enlightenment, isn't it?
I guess it is.
Yeah, okay.
And so the lower right-hand corner there, you saw Spinoza's view that God just is nature, and we're trying. Ben, the illustrator, had a tough time trying to take very abstract philosophical ideas and turn them into concrete visual images, and that's how he decided he was going to illustrate the claim that God is nature.
That's what I would have seen. Yeah. And then?
And this is Spinoza's reaction to political turmoil in the Netherlands in the late 1660s as he saw the increasing power of the ecclesiastics. He was concerned about the future of the Republic and decided that he was going to compose this book, the Theological Political Treatise, in which he was going to defend the values that he thought were essential to the well-being of the state.
Wow.
So he was a very, very early secular activist.
Absolutely, yes.
So I don't think he would have used the term separation of church and state, but something like that?
He would have, but for a different reason. He was seeking separation of church and the state in the sense that the church should have no political influence whatsoever. He did not pursue the separation of church and state in that he thought that the political authorities had the right to regulate religious practices. People should be free to believe whatever they wanted, and they should be free to express themselves however they wanted. But when a religious organization also engages in practical matters like forms of worship or organized activities, anything involving organized activities falls into the public domain. And the political sovereign, whether it's a democracy, an aristocracy, or a monarchy, it's the political sovereign who has the right to control what happens in the public domain, behavior. And that's where the political authorities should be able to regulate the activities of religious organizations.
So philosophy has practical consequences then in how
Of
we
course.
live our lives. So.
Yes.
Is
Well, it still does. I mean,
Yeah.
I think philosophy shouldn't be this abstract engagement where you sit back in an armchair and think about this or that problem, metaphysics. But like going back to Socrates, philosophy should be about how is one to live a good life? What is happiness, and how is one to achieve a kind of flourishing? And how should one treat other human beings?
I think we have more of Spinoza to look at, more pages. This is a fun book.
Yeah, so there you have God, or at least a picture or conception of God, the one that Spinoza is arguing against, and his claim that the Bible was not written by any divinity, but simply a work of human literature. And the prophets who wrote the Bible were just people with deep ethical character and very good storytellers. And this got, as you see here, this got Spinoza into some trouble.
Did he really write on a wall?
He did not, as far as we know.
It's just a representation.
Graffiti was not within his character.
Yeah. But he sure made a statement, though, where he lived. And where
He certainly did, yes. And in fact, the term Spinozist or Spinozism became a term of disapproval, a kind of label you would attach to somebody who you disagreed with, the way in which the word communist was used in the 1940s and 1950s in this country to put somebody under suspicion. So in the 17th century, calling somebody a Spinozist was a way of casting suspicion upon them.
Well, I think it would be a great compliment.
I agree.
Maybe that's where the phrase "no spin zone" came from. Maybe. Who knows?
Now, are we moving on to someone
We're
else?
going to go to Leibniz. Who is this here?
This is Leibniz, who
Leibniz?
was passing through The Hague and decided he was going to pay Spinoza a visit because he had heard about Spinoza's ideas and maybe even have read some of Spinoza's writings, and he wanted a face-to-face dialogue.
Huh. And then is this Malebranche here?
This still looks like Leibniz.
Oh, Leibniz, okay.
Right.
So tell us quickly about Leibniz.
Leibniz believed that this is the best of all possible worlds, but that doesn't mean that everybody is going to flourish. And the best of all possible worlds was, so Leibniz was not an atheist. Mm-hmm. He believed that there is a providential God who makes a choice of this world over other possible worlds. God chooses this best of all possible worlds because God necessarily must do the best, even though the best of all possible worlds will include things that aren't so convenient for every single person in it.
So why was he considered a heretic?
His views on grace, on freedom, and fairly technical matters that the church believed undermined. Well, first of all, Leibniz was a Lutheran. And his writings were perceived to undermine Catholic teachings on grace and freedom.
So when Voltaire wrote Candida, was he referring to Leibniz?
He was. There was a caricature of Leibniz. Candida is very amusing because these tremendously horrible things happen, but in the play, everything turns out for the best. Leibniz was not saying everything's going to turn out to the best for you or you or you, but the whole world is the best.
And now here comes Malebranche. Did I say that right?
You did. Malebranche was an interesting character because he believed that natural things, bodies and human minds, don't have any causal powers of their own, that whatever happens in nature is brought about directly by God. God is ubiquitously, causally responsible
kind
for
of
everything.
theistic determinism. Then,
Yes.
Well, there's the Quran talks about that, and so does the Bible. God ordains and sets everything up.
Well, it's one thing to say everything has been ordained by God. It's another thing to say that God actively carries out this thing by being causally engaged in every event in nature.
So Hypatia Bradlaugh Bonner, who was a free-thinking woman, the daughter of
Charles Bradlaugh,
who was an atheist that they wouldn't seat in Parliament, wrote some things, and one of them I think is a lovely motto. She said, "Heresy makes progress." So we should be saluting all these heretics, correct?
We should. Without creative and original minds like this, where would we be?
Right.
And you have some names in the book I haven't heard of. Somebody named Gassendi, is that right?
He was a Catholic priest, but with fairly unorthodox philosophical views, especially from the perspective of the church.
So a lot of those people were kind of straddling. The Enlightenment was a time where you had one foot in the past and another in the future. Like Isaac Newton was like that. Isaac Newton just really brought us, and yet he was still doing alchemy and counting the steps of the Temple of David.
And a deeply religious man, Newton was.
Yeah. And yet what did he do for science?
He created a brand new way of looking at the laws of nature and of thinking about how bodies act and putting a mathematical framework on some of the most important forces that operate on us.
And then, I don't think we have any pictures of Voltaire, but you jump ahead into like the 1750s with Voltaire to end the book.
Right, Voltaire has a nice perspective looking back. It seemed like a good way to finish the story because Voltaire commented on what was happening in the 17th century. And if we think of the 17th century as making what we now think of as the Enlightenment possible, why not have an Enlightenment figure look back on his predecessors?
And that's what I feel like the secular movement has to be doing, and we're still fighting for the Enlightenment. There are still many threats to the Enlightenment here and worldwide.
Yeah, especially these days.
Yes.
So I'm sure you've read some of the scientists I've read who assert that philosophy is dead. Because philosophy used to be physics and science and all these unanswered questions. But now that science is answering everything, do we even need philosophy anymore?
Well, first of all, it's not clear that science is answering everything. I mean, I think there are a lot of questions about morality, about aesthetics, even about metaphysics that is not just that science isn't answering them, but science may not be able to answer them. So, as you know, we should put all our faith in the advancement of science, but also recognize that there are some questions that we have to answer not from the perspective of science, but from the perspective of moral intuitions and what we believe is right and wrong.
I see that Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein wrote a really good blurb for your book, and she's one of those pro-philosophy is still alive and doing very well.
I think philosophy will always be alive, yes.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen Nadler.
For bringing it to life.
Thank you for having me.
Maybe someday we can have Ben on the show and talk about the countless hours he must have put into illustrating that book.
He can tell you all about it. Sure.
Wow, and he's working on a new book now too, right?
Yes, a book on Socrates.
Wow, okay, great.
Another free thinker.
Thank you. We've been talking with Stephen Nadler, who's an author. He's professor of philosophy at the University of Wisconsin, right here in Madison, just a few blocks from the studio here. So thank you very much. And thank you for watching Free Thought Matters.
Because free thought matters.